Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Kunal here. Today we are going to read about the general principles of environmental law, that is chapter 26. But before that, we will cover two questions of the sustainable development. The question is: show impact of the Gopal gas tragedy on the formation of laws of the environment enacted in the second phase from 1984 to 1997. Answer: the Bhopal gas tragedy 1984 was a catastrophic that made no parallel in the world's industrial history. In the early morning hours of December 3, 1984, a rolling wind carried a poisonous grey cloud from the Union Card, Cardide plant in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, India. 40 tons of toxic gas, methiocyanate (MIC), was accidentally released from Union Carbide's Bhopal plant, which leaked and spread in the city. The result was a nightmare that still has no end. Residents awoke the clouds of suffocating gas and began running desperately through the dark streets. Victims arrived at hospitals, breathless and blind. The lungs, brains, eyes, muscles, all well as gastrointestinal, neurological, reproductive, and immune systems of those who survived were severely affected. An estimated 10,000 or more people died. About 5 lakh more people suffering agonizing injuries with disastrous effects of massive poisoning. None can say if future generations will not be affected. The Gopal gas tragedy led to the reinterpretation of existing laws and regulations. Legislation: the Environment Protection Act (EPA) was enacted in 1986. The scope of this act is very wide and it operates on the principle of arresting pollution at the source. Polluter pays, and also it emphasized an involvement of the public in decision making under the EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. It has become mandatory to seek the environmental clearance for several activities and industries with the involvement of the public as per procedure. Next question: what are the significant features of the third and the fourth phases of Indian environmental laws? In the third phase of the Indian environmental law, the main focus was on combining economic development with social and environmental issues. Legislation and amendments to the existing legislations have been done to achieve compliance with the Agreement of Trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, keeping in mind the principles of the Convention and of the Biological Diversity, CDB. The Biological Diversity Act 2002 was framed on the basis of the principles of CDB. The legislations are directed towards ensuring the sovereign rights of the countries over their genetic and biological resources and the acceptance of the need to share benefit flowing from the commercial utilization of biological resources with holders of the indigenous knowledge. The Patents Amendment Act of 2005 was enacted, which has a provision to prevent misappropriation of the indigenous knowledge of communities by taking it non-patentable. The Geographical Indications of Good Registration and Protection Act 1999 was enacted to facilitate protection to the collective rights of the rural and the indigenous community in their unique products. In this phase, under the EPA, several secondary legislation dealing with the waste management and recycling of the substances like plastics were also formulated. The rights based approach in the significant features of this fourth phase, the focus on the right based approach is on ensuring the rights of all sections of the community, particularly marginalized. These include legislation like the Human Rights Act 1993 with the Amendment Act 2006, the Right of the Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act 2009, and Commission for the Protection of the Child's Rights Act 2005. Maintenance and Welfare Parents and Senior Citizens Act 2007, uh, People with Disabilities Act 1995. For instance, the right of the traditional forest dwellers have been codified in the Forest Rights Act 2006. The act seeks to reconcile the need of the forest dwellers with the need to conserve wildlife and forests. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 was amended in 2002, and it seeks to provide for particular segment and of the buffer around the national parks and the sanctuaries, and introduced the concept of community reserve. This phase also continued to focus on the environment through the Environmental Impact Assessment Notification of 2006. The hazardous was notified wastes management, handling, and transboundary movement rules 2008, and the e-waste management and handling rules 2011. Now let's start chapter 26, general principles of environmental law. Chapter at glance: the environmental challenges facing individuals, communities, private companies, and governments throughout the world are numerous and complex. Most most governments, companies, and civil societies organizations now recognize that environmental issues are intertwined with social, cultural, economic issues. Promoting economic growth with environmental, human health, and cultural safeguards in place seems to be the path forward for the most government, but decade of the environmental mismanagement have created severe legacy issues in most countries. According to the Supreme Court, pollution is a civil wrong, but it is very nature, it is a tort committed against the community as a whole. A person, therefore, who is guilty of causing pollution has to compensate for the restoration of damage caused by the environment and the ecology. This led to the polluter pays principle, according to which who provides pollution should bear the cost of managing it to prevent damage to human health or the environment. The principle got popularized by the effort of organizations for economic cooperation and development. OECD. The OECD defines it as a concept where manufacturers and importers of product should bear a significant degree of responsibility for the environmental impacts of their products throughout the product life cycle, including upstream impacts inherent in the selection of the materials for the products, impacts from manufacturers, production process itself, and downstream impact from the use and the disposal of the products. The Environmental Protection Act 1986 also empowers the government to take all such measures as it deems necessary or expedient for the purpose of the protecting and improving the quality of environment. The Rio Declaration of 1992 had also acknowledged the polluter pays principle in the Principle 16. It claims that national authorities should endeavor to promote the internalization of environmental costs and the use of economic instruments, taking into the amount of the approach that the polluter should bear the cost of the pollution with due regard to the public interest and without distorting international trade and investment. The polluter pays principle exposes the polluter to twofold liability, that is, the compensation to the victim of pollution and ecological restoration. But for many, it simply means pay and pollute. Precautionary principles also possesses a significant place in Rio Declaration of 1992. According to Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by the states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats as serious as irreversible environmental degradation, the precautionary principle ensures that a substance or activity posing a threat to the environment is prevented from adversely affecting it, even if there is no conclusive scientific proof linking that particular substance or activity to the environmental damage. The principle is based on the theory that it is better to be on the side of caution and prevent environmental harm, which may indeed become irreversible. The doctrine of the public interest, a legal theory developed in the ancient Roman Empire, was based on the idea that certain common properties such as rivers, seashores, forests, and the air were held by government in trusteeship for the free and the unrestricted use of the general public. This led to the public interest doctrine that states that certain resources are preserved for the public use and the government is required to maintain them for the reasonable use of the public. The doctrine rejoins upon the government to protect the resources for the enjoyment of the public, of the general public, rather than the permit than to permit their use of the private ownership or for the commercial purposes. as the resources are a gift of the nature. The doctrine imposes the three kinds of restrictions on the state. First, the property must not only be used for a public purpose, it must be available for use by the general public. The property must not be sold even for fair such cash equivalent. The property must be maintained for particular kind of uses such as navigation, recreation or fishery. Define the term environment. Define the term environment. Everything that surrounds us is our environment. The term environment is a sum total of the water, air, and land and the interrelationship that exists along them with the human beings, other living organisms, and materials. What do you understand by the term pollution? Pollution occurs when pollutants contaminate the natural surroundings, which bring about changes that affect our normal lifestyle adversely. Pollutants are the key to elements and the components of pollution, which are generally waste materials of different forms. Pollution disturbs our ecosystem and the balance in the environment. Pollution occurs in different forms: oil, water, soil, radioactive noise, heat, thermal, and light. In text question 26.2, explain the polluter pays principle. The concept of polluter pays principle was given by Thomas Lindqvist for the Swedish government in 1990. It is also known as extended producer responsibility. The polluter pays principle is the commonly accepted practice that those who produce pollution should bear the cost of managing it to prevent damage to human health or the environment. For instance, a factory that produces a potentially poisonous substance as a byproduct of its activities is usually held responsible for its safe disposal. Discuss Principle 16 of RIO Declaration of 1992. The Principle of 16 of RIO Declaration of 1992 gives prominent place to the polluter pays principle. According to the Principle 16 of RIO Declaration of 1992, national authorities should endeavor to promote the internalization of the environmental cost and the use of the economic instruments, taking into account the approach that the polluter should bear the cost of the pollution with due regard to the public interest and without distorting the international trade and investment. The polluter pays principle exposes the polluter to the two-fold liability. True or false? True. The polluter pays principle can be applied only after the pollution has already taken place. True. In text question 26.4, define the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle applies to human health and the environment. The ethical assumption behind the precautionary principle is that humans are responsible to protect, preserve, and restore the global ecosystem on which all life, including our own, depends. The precautionary principles ensure that a substance or activity posing a threat to the environment is prevented from adversely affecting it, even if there is no inconclusive scientific proof linking that particular substance or activity to the environmental damage. The precautionary principle is also powerful that it serves as a guide to making wiser decisions in the face of uncertainty. Any action that contributes to preventing harm to humans and the environment, learning from about the consequences of actions and acting appropriately in precautionary is precautionary. Identify the two essential ingredients of the precautionary principle. The two essential ingredients of the precautionary principles are: first, the environmental measures by the state government and the statutory authorities like State Pollution Board must anticipate, prevent and attack the causes of the environmental degradation. When there are threats of serious and irreversible damage, lack of scientific certainty, it should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent environmental degradation. In text question 26.5, define the public interest doctrine principle. According to the public interest doctrine principle, certain resources are preserved for a public use and the government must maintain them for the reasonable use of public. The public trust doctrine primarily rests on the principle that certain resources like sea, water, air, and the forest have such a great importance to the people as a whole that it would be wholly unjustified to make them a subject of private ownership as they are just a gift of honor. List the restrictions imposed on state of the public trust doctrine. Their answer: there are three kinds of restriction imposed on the state by the state or by the public interest doctrine, which are as follows. The property must not only be used for public purpose, it must be available for the use by the general public. The property must be sold even for fair such equivalent. The property must be maintained for particularly kind of uses such as navigation, recreation or fisheries. Terminal question: what is the twofold liability in the polluter pays principle? The polluter pays principle explores the polluter twofold liability, namely, first, compensation of the victims of pollution, and second, ecological restoration. This is called twofold liability. Thank you and thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Kindly subscribe.